I like the chalice this morning as a celebration of life. All life. We are the fortunate receivers of thousands of generations before us, and we pass on to others, thousands behind us. May we all celebrate and remember life. Why do we come to church every Sunday? Why go to church at all? What's in it for you? Going to church is just a habit you do every Sunday morning? Is it the people? Most people would say that it probably was. But might there be some other reason for attending church? Going to church has virtually ended in Europe, and the practice is rapidly on the decline in the United States. Why do you suppose that is? This morning, I'm going to reflect on why I go to church, and perhaps you may find some of my thoughts of interest to you. Come, let us explore church-going together. Our opening hymn in our hymnal is number 279, By the Waters of Babylon.
By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion. By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion. By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion.
A 100 years ago, it was common for churches to display notices like public worship, 11 a.m. in the morning. What's important to notice is that the weekly practice of going to church was referred to as public worship. It meant the worship of Christian values. And in those days, just about half of the population were in church on any given Sunday morning. As an adolescent in the 1960s, I attended Wickline Methodist Church in Midwest City, Oklahoma. They had a fairly large adult congregation, a vibrant choir, and an active MYF, that is, Methodist Youth Fellowship, in which I participated. But today, not nearly as many people attend church on Sunday as they did in the past. It can no longer be called public worship because the public doesn't worship anymore. So my question this morning is, why go to church? It's becoming a common question among those who still go to church. Why are we here this morning? I shall not ask you why you go, but I shall give you the reasons why I attend church. Let me begin with a little history about church going, and then I will tell you why I think it's important. For much of the history to follow, I am deeply indebted to one of my very favorite theologians, the Reverend Sir Lloyd Gearing of New Zealand. It has not always been known as church-going. That's a very modern expression. You may think that church weekly gatherings begin with Christian churches, but you'd be wrong. To discover the origin of church-going, we have to go back 26 centuries to a land that today we call Iraq. We need to go back to a time between 550 and 400 BCE. It all began with the result of a cultural collapse. At the beginning of the 6th century, long before the Christian era, an expanding Babylonian empire conquered Jerusalem, burned the temple, and carried off as prisoners the elite members of the Hebrew society. The royal family, the aristocracy, the priests, and the educated classes were all taken from their homeland and resettled in what was the most sophisticated city of the time, Babylon. That should have been, and normally would have been, the end of the Hebrew people. But this national catastrophe inspired an amazing amount of cultural creativity. By comparing those who went on to exile with those who did not, we see a difference. It is from that difference that we date the worship of only one God, the beginnings of the Hebrew Scripture, what we call today the Old Testament, and the weekly gathering on the 7th day, Saturday. Those who went into exile as displaced citizens of the kingdom of Judah returned with a brand new faith, one that today we call Judaism. The beginnings of Judaism are reflected in the ancient hymn that we sang this morning. The words are from a written psalm of that time. By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Out of the practice of gathering together to weep and remember, there came a new faith and a new type of institution to house it. It was unlike any that had occurred up to that time. From this simple beginning, there evolved the institution of the synagogue. Synagogue is a Greek word that literally means gathering together. As the Hebrew exiles gathered together and remembered, they compiled their traditions and sagas into one continuous story. A story that today we call the Torah. They did more than just record the past history. They creatively speculated about the very creation itself. The first chapter of what we call the Bible was composed in Babylon. It was a first attempt at what today's scientists call a theory of everything. It was so brilliantly simple that it remained convincing for thousands of years. And in addition, it explained why we needed to rest every 7th day. Because that's what God did after He created the world. From this beginning came the Jewish practice of gathering together every 7th day of the week to read the Torah. The Christian practice of gathering on the first day of the week to read the Bible, and the Muslim practice of gathering on the 6th day of the week to read the Quran. This was a new kind of religious institution. It was not led by priests, but rather by scholars and scribes. A synagogue is not a place to house a god, a temple, but a place of study, a place to house the community. The synagogue has been considered a layman's institute. In the Jewish synagogue, the rabbi is a scholar and a teacher, not a priest. For the first 200 or 300 years, actually for 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity, the chief officers of the church were not called priests at all. but rather bishops, presbyters, or deacons, words which in Greek literally mean overseers, elders, and servers. The idea of a Christian church grew out of the synagogue, not the temple. The first churches were simply Christian synagogues, doing much the same thing that the Jews were doing. They read and studied the scriptures, they prayed, they shared a common meal of bread and wine. Over the course of the past 2 centuries, the synagogue, the church, and the mosque have all evolved, each in their own way. Today they look very different from one another, but underneath, we can detect a common component in all three: a coming together of people to celebrate what they have inherited. In each, they read their communal story. In their own scriptures, they prayed and they socialized. I have described the origins of the church-going so that we might distinguish between what is significant about church-going and what is not. The first thing to notice is that going to church is not about going to a holy building, but rather about joining a gathering of people. It is people that make the church holy, not the other way around. Therefore, coming to church means to be a part of a community, sharing in the life of that community. Quite recently, in 2013, some atheists in England discovered that they were missing something in no longer going to church. They felt they had thrown out the baby with the bathwater. As a result, 2 comedians, Sanford Jones and Pippa Evans, took it upon themselves to call a meeting in an old abandoned church in North London. 300 people showed up at that first meeting. They decided to meet twice a month, and they moved to a larger place, Conway Hall in London, which housed as many as 600 people, which they filled up at times. They called themselves the Sunday Assembly, and they set out to raise the capital needed to spread their new version of church. Following these beginnings in London, Sunday assemblies have been held in about 90 cities, both in Europe and around the world, including the United States, the Netherlands, Germany, New Zealand and Australia, Canada, and Hungary. What do? They socialize. They sing. They listen to talks that offer inspiration, that are thought-provoking and emotionally stimulating, and provide practical ideas about how to live the way they want to live and be the way they want to be. Their motto is, live better, help often, wonder more. They believe that meeting together, they can help one another achieve these goals. Awareness of the shortness of life and the finality of death, they seek to get the most out of life by helping one another in doing so. In other words, they celebrate life, but without reference to God. For many people today, God has become a stumbling block. That is understandable. The very idea of a supernatural, superhuman God created the world and continues to control it is an idea that became very questionable in the 20th century. Those in the Christian churches may not have noticed that the word God is hardly ever used anymore these days. Back in the 1960s, some theologians, echoing Nietzsche, announced that God is dead. What they meant was that the idea of God is going out of use. Some 50 years ago, the Oxford theologian John McIntyre observed that people once knew or thought they knew what they meant when they spoke of God, and they spoke of Him often. Now, in the course of a day's business, they may not mention Him at all. The name God seems to have been retired from everyday discourse. Let me put it this way. Long ago, when 2 people parted, they said, "God be with you." That somehow got shortened to goodbye. Today, we say, "Have a nice day." The evolution of the word God was studied by the theologian Don Fielding of Cambridge, and he found that indeed the word God was disappearing. But even more interestingly, it was being replaced by another word, the word life. He also found that today we use a lot more phrases about life than we do about God. And some of them are quite new. For an example, "Don't waste your life." "I want to get on with life." "Such is life." That's what life's all about. And my favorite, "Get a life." He called his book about the research "The New Religion of Life," published in 1999. What we learn is that religion has become secular and life has become sacred. Molly, you weren't down. Here, baby. Life has become sacred, and what we once called the worship of God has now more appropriately become the celebration of life. And that is exactly what Sunday Assembly was trying to construct, a celebration of life. They were trying to create a godless church by creating a mutually supporting community. And that is also exactly what the ancient Jewish exiles were trying to do. And that is still a good reason to go to church today, to celebrate life and to sort out and examine the values by which we live so that we can live life to the fullest. Today we live in a very confusing world, and the ways of our predecessors just doesn't work anymore. We are very much like those ancient Babylonian exiles who gathered together to come to grips with the loss of their past. And like them, we too need to be creative. As they were confronted by new ideas, so are we confronted by a world of accelerating change, some of which we welcome, some we deplore. Today, human knowledge is exploding at an exponential rate. Beliefs and practices are changing rapidly. Many of the old absolutes we used to depend upon have disappeared. We often find ourselves not knowing what to believe or where to turn for security and certainty. And that is a good reason we still come together today, to assist one another in the search for answers. In his 1966 book, After Auschwitz, the American rabbi Richard Rubinstein acknowledged that it was no longer possible to believe in the traditional God of the Jews after the Holocaust. The God who, according to myths, saved the escaping Hebrews on the shores of the Red Sea has failed to do so in the death camps of Auschwitz and Dachau. In the words of the young Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was executed on a command from Adolf Hitler, wrote from his prison cell, "We are moving towards a completely religionless time. People simply can't be religious anymore." Bonhoeffer wondered how we could speak of God in a secular way. Rubinstein believed that God is no longer available as a source of meaning or value. Our problem now is how to learn to be religious in a time of the death of God. He wrote, "How can men best share the decisive crises of life given the cold, unfeeling, indifferent cosmos that surrounds us, and given the fact that God, the holy nothingness, offers us only dissolution and death as a way out of the dilemmas of earthly existence?" He concluded that the reason to continue going to synagogue was because this was how we share our lives in an unfeeling, silent cosmos. He called going to synagogue a flickering candle in the dark. And for the same reason, we too light a chalice, because that is how we share our lives too. Robert Bellah, a sociologist, wrote in 1970, entitled Beyond Belief, in which he said, people must work out their own ultimate solutions to the meaning of life. What the institutional church can do is to provide the most favorable environment for doing so, without imposing on them a prefabricated set of answers. Here's the reason for going to church, and that is what both Unitarian and secular churches like Sunday Assembly try to accomplish. They work hard not to tell you how it is, that there is a God, that a good life can be had if it was just believed, that life exists after death, etc. Church is not here to provide authoritarian answers to the meaning of life. We have to construct our own answers, and this is a good place for doing just that. That is to say, the purpose of going to church is, just as the ancient Jews in Babylon, to come together, to acknowledge our predicament, to assist one another in creating meaning in our lives. Meaning comes about out of not just anything, but rather out of the culture and the traditions that have made us. That is why we need to tell and retell the stories of our traditions, to hear talks and sing songs. Church does not and should not provide us with ready-made answers, but it can and should provide the material out of which we can construct our own answers. And incidentally, that is why I call the talks that I give not sermons with answers, but reflections. I have reflected on what is meaningful to me, or I hope to give you material with which you can build your own meanings. Sunday Assembly outlined in simple form the basic reason for going to church. It is to celebrate life and to assist one another in getting the most out of life. And that is why I go to church. Our closing hymn is We Gather Together, number 349 in our hymnal.
We gather together in joyful thanksgiving, acclaiming creation whose bounty we share. Oh, sorrow and gladness we find now in our living. We sing a hymn of praise to the life that we bear. We gather together to join the journey, conferring, collating our passage to be a true affirmation in joy and tribulation, when bound to human care, then we are free.
Gertrude Stein is reported to have once said, "There ain't no answer. There ain't going to be any answer. There never has been an answer. That's the answer." Stein may well have been right, that there may be no answer. But that does not mean that we cannot and should not gather together to explore what that means to live, regardless of whether there is an answer or not. Nor that we cannot have a full life even if there is no answer. Going to church is how we explore life's challenges and share what we find with one another. I offer you the church that provides the environment to learn and explore the meaning of life as the best available means to a rich and full life. I can think of no better reason to go to church. Throw in those people we live and love, and church just might be the best deal around. How can you not go to church? We extinguished the chalice this morning, which has provided us the light of understanding and the warmth of compassion. May the celebration of life remain with us in all our days to come until we meet together again. Our closing music this morning is by the Unitarian Hungarian Béla Bartók. His son, incidentally, was the president of the Hungarian Unitarian Association in Europe.
Good morning. My name is Rev Dr Don Fielding, and I am looking forward to being with you next Sunday. James Baldwin wrote some time ago, "Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within." I use the word love here not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being or a state of grace, not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. As we celebrate this month of June as LGBTQ month, Pride Month, we are invited to reflect on love and its power in helping us to live our authentic selves. What does it mean to truly love your neighbor? Where do you see that kind of love in your life today? And what is the call of love to you today? Come and join next Sunday.